good evening and welcome. Tonight we'll be going over the history and geography of Djibouti. Now let's talk about the obvious first. Yes, it does have a very funny name called Djibouti. And the capital city is also known as Djibouti. Its name comes from an unknown origin. There's a lot of different words it could have come from, but none of them have to do with anything that sounds like the word booty. But yes, it is a big funny haha in the geography community, I suppose, to make funny little puns about the name. In the same way that, astronomers make funny haha puns about Uranus or Uranus, It's almost exactly the same kind of humor, actually. So, with that out of the way, Djibouti is a very small country in the Horn of Africa. It borders Eritrea up here, Ethiopia all down here, and this is Somaliland, which is a part of Somalia that has declared independence but is not internationally recognized. So Somalia, but technically Somaliland. And Djibouti sits at a very important spot in the world. This up here is the Red Sea. That's the A in sea, Red Sea. Over here is the Gulf of Aden, which just cuts here under Yemen. It's the point right here at the Bab el-Mandab Strait, where the Indian Ocean meets the Red Sea, which means that right up here is the Suez Canal, my pencil shipping boat going up to the Suez Canal. So this little corner here is a very important spot for the global economy and trade. The capital city, as you can see, is right on the ocean. It's a very big port city. And right here on the Gulf of Tajora. But other than that, Djibouti is basically just a bunch of rocky, mountainous desert without much to it. Not a lot of arable land. Their only two major lakes are salt lakes. Right here on the border of Ethiopia is Lake Abe, And then up here is Lake Assal, which I was trying not to say when I was saying Lake Abe. Lake Assal is the second lowest point on Earth, besides the Dead Sea, of course, would be number one, making this the lowest point in Africa. How does that come to be? Djibouti has a crack right down the middle. Nice. Hold your applause to the end, please. I know it's hilarious humor. Right down here is the start of the Great Rift Valley, where two tectonic plates in Africa are pulling apart, hence creating a depression. It also creates lots of earthquakes and volcanic activity. Djibouti does have an active volcano, but it hasn't erupted in a while. Its tallest mountain is actually right here, right on the border of Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. It is Musa Ali, I believe, but it's in the Musa Ali range, but I couldn't find any references of the mountain having its own name, so I assume the mountain is called Musa Ali in the Musa Ali mountain range. But Djibouti has 8 total mountain ranges going through it, which tells you just how mountainous this little country is. I mean, you can tell I'm super zoomed in, right? There's my thumb, there's Djibouti, and this is the biggest map I could find in my big atlas. Let's see, what else should I tell you? Major cities, of course, are the capital city of Djibouti, where I think it was 60% of the population lives. Opak is another very major port city, has been since ancient times. Well, not ancient times, but for a very, very long time. There are other little towns, but for the most part, Djibouti is pretty barren and empty. Very beautiful, of course, lots of wonderful wildlife and things, but very barren nonetheless. And Djibouti, being where it is in the world, right here, this important spot, is home to many military bases who are based there mainly just to keep an eye on the shipping routes going through, because you can imagine how busy this little strait is, and just making sure that their economic interests are intact. The French Foreign Legion is based here, as you're going to learn in its history. The French built a big military base here and occupied it for a very long time, but they withdrew, and now it's just the French Foreign Legion that are stationed here. The United States bought, I believe they bought that French military base, and they're stationed there now. It's the only permanent United States military base in Africa. Also, China, Japan, and Italy have military bases in Djibouti as well, which China and Japan do not have any other military bases outside of their country. So, yeah, it would be an unusual fact if not for the obvious fact that they're there to make sure that shipping goes smoothly. And before we get into history, I'm not sure where to put this in to my script on Djibouti history, but there are many different ethnic groups all throughout Djibouti, but there are two major ones. The first one is known as the Afar, and the other one would be a Somali group known as the Isa. They're very closely related, but politically have differences, so just keep that in mind. They're the two main cultures that live in Djibouti. So for its history, there's been evidence of human life in Djibouti, like very, very ancient human life. Even before human life, there's evidence of Homo ergaster and Homo erectus living in here. There's lots of fossils of prehistoric animals that were hunted by our ancient ancestors. There's rock art, like all the bells and whistles of like caveman life, like tools and little bits of bone, all those things. But the most interesting part of its ancient history, at least in my opinion, and if anyone else is into Egyptology or went into that Egypt phase as a kid, Djibouti is most likely part of the location of the kingdom land of Punt. Punt, if you don't know, was a land that traded with ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt loved Punt. Punt had all kinds of riches. They had gold and animal skins and all kinds of things they loved to trade. They have, in the pyramids, there's drawings of traders from Punt coming with all their goods, and, they really, really loved their friends in Punt. The only thing is that nobody in ancient Egypt wrote down where Punt was. It is lost to history. It will forever be a mystery. No one will ever know for sure, but historians agree that it is most likely in this Horn of Africa region along the coast. So I've already covered Eritrea, so that was also part of the kingdom of Punt, but it's also believed that it would have been in this area as well. But like I said, we'll never know for sure. The first major kingdom really to pop up in the area would have been in the early 9th century. It was known as the Kingdom of Adal. And as you can imagine, being where it is in the world, it had a lot of trade with many, many other countries from all over the world. Well, the Eastern world, of course. And since, Yemen is literally right here, which means Saudi Arabia is literally right up there, very, very close by. Once Islam became a thing and started expanding, this kingdom was one of the first in the world to really embrace Islam, and Islam is still the dominant religion of the day. Really, really interesting. It's home to one of the oldest mosques in Africa. Well, the kingdom was. It's now in Somaliland, but anyway, details. The Afat Sultanate rose to prominence in 1285, basically the dynasty that ruled over what was the Kingdom of Adal. They were pretty powerful in their prime, but there was another sultanate more in the southern Ethiopia area called the Sultanate of Shewa, and they argued and warred over territory a lot, and that really, really weakened the Ifat Sultanate to the point where the Christian Ethiopian kingdom managed to defeat them and very severely weakened them to the point of collapse. So then the Adal Sultanate became a thing, and they ruled the area until 1577, when it was absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. Except for a little brief interlude when I mentioned him in my video on Syria, and I believe Turkey as well, but the Pasha of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, he woke up and chose invasion, and before he tried to conquer Syria and failed, he swept in and took over all of this territory. And the various, sultans and people who were in charge of the land weren't very happy about that. The French came in to help them because, this was just after Napoleon, and Napoleon had conquered Egypt, and once that was gone, this dude rose to power, and France, still wanted to capitalize on the whole Egypt thing. It's a long story. We'll get into that whenever we get to France in my series. But this guy's plans for invasion basically failed. I mean, he managed to set up what is basically the framework of the Egyptian government today in a nutshell, but all the places he invaded, it all really collapsed and did not quite work. So it eventually came back under Ottoman rule. The rule of the French begins in 1883. They never really left. Their presence was still there after the whole Pasha invasion, I suppose. But the Scramble for Africa happened, which was when all of the major European leaders got together and just basically took out a map of Africa and negotiated over who wanted what. France said they wanted this little corner, and, Britain and Italy had other corners on the Horn of Africa, so it was like, sure, you can have this little bit. So, France went to the sultans of Afar and negotiated, and the Afar sultans just straight up sold their land. Basically, it was the majority of this land up here. For the Isas, they didn't sell their land, but they did sign an agreement for protection. So, like, the French could be there. They don't technically, own it outright, but they're there to provide any kind of, protection, like I said. France established the city of Djibouti here to make a new port city. It's very beautiful now in that it looks very, very French. Lots of French architecture. Not like classic, like Parisian France, but French nonetheless. I want to say kind of more in a southern French style. But anyway, so the main point of the port of Djibouti was to, not only be a port city, but to be a connection to a railroad from Ethiopia. And that made Djibouti a big boom town. And then it wasn't known as Djibouti then. It was known as French Somaliland. And they ruled for, well, getting ahead of myself. World War II happens, right? The Italians had invaded Ethiopia, so there were clashes along the border there, but then the Nazi Germans invaded France. So this area was controlled by Vichy France, which was like the pro-Axis France. So eventually the British came by to try to protect this area because, very valuable. And they blockaded the city of Djibouti to try to keep any resources out. And they eventually invaded and occupied the city in 1942. So, after the dust settled from World War II, independence became the hot new trend in Africa. Their neighbor Somalia had gained independence, and they said, what about us? So they held a referendum in 1958 to vote if they should be independent or stay with France, and they voted to stay with France, which there were allegations of voter fraud, and the big debate was that most of the people who voted to stay with France were Afar, and most of the people who voted for independence were Somali. And the Somali Isas mainly wanted independence so that they could sign an agreement with Somalia and become part of Somalia eventually down the road. But they voted to stay with France, and there were riots and outrage over it, of course, but it was what it was. In 1966, the UN told France that they highly recommended that they have an independence referendum. Charles de Gaulle visited the area that year, and that sparked a lot of protests and riots, so Charles de Gaulle ordered another referendum. So that happened in 1967, and they still voted to stay with France, but to have looser control. And that included renaming the country from French Somaliland to the English name is the French territory of the Afars, and he says there were more riots about this and more outrage because, once again, the Afars voted to be with France and the Isas voted to be independent. Liberation groups started to spring up during this time, and they were fairly violent. I mean, in my research in other African countries, there were far, far, far more violent liberation groups, but these groups did things like they would take hostages and hijack buses and, all of those bells and whistles, but the liberation groups did eventually come together to figure out what their unified goal would be, and they decided that it would be independence and not a union with Somalia. So eventually they had a third referendum on May 8th, 1977, and would you believe, they voted for independence in a landslide, 98.8% of the vote voting for independence. So on June 27th of that year, 1977, Djibouti became independent, and they renamed their country after the city. So Djibouti did have a big civil war in the 90s, and that's because of their two political parties, which again, Afars and Isas, right? Both interests clashing, which just led down a slippery slope toward a civil war, violent rallies and all of that. We won't get into the details of that, but it did end peacefully in the year 2000. There were Arab Spring protests in Djibouti in 2011 when that was, a big craze happening all across Africa and the Middle East. Well, Northern Africa, I should say. Their reason for protesting was because of their president, Ismail Omar Guelleh, or IOG as he's known as. He had just decided to change the constitution so he could run for a third term, which people weren't happy about. Big protests, but there was an election coming up, and the whole Arab Spring movement died down after that because he was elected for a third term, and another term because he was the only one on the ballot, and then another term because his opponents were very inconveniently jailed somehow. What a mystery. And there was just another election in 2021 where, wow, he had another landslide victory. I mean, what are the odds of that happening? But I think we all know. It is a very destitute country, obviously. It's run by a dictator who has financial interests over the interests of his people. I watched a lot of tourism videos. I do that for any country I don't know a lot about. And they were all like, do not be a tourist in this country, because if you take out your camera, you're like immediately swarmed by police asking what you're doing and what you're taking photos of and why you're there. Like, you can come visit, just don't take any pictures or be as sly as possible, because like the police are apparently on like every corner with guns ready to either like arrest you or charge you a fee. It's just rampant corruption everywhere. But that, in a nutshell, is the history of Djibouti. So that is all for tonight. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a very good night. Good night. Good night. Good night.